Good morning. It's morning where I'm at. Hope you're having a good day. Today we're talking about perception. Because of the length of these slides, I'm going to break it up into three parts. The last part being this kind of fun. So let's jump right in and talk about perception and how we perceive the world around us. What makes us think the way we think when we get the stimuli we get. So start about perception. It's a cognitive process that we can't control. It just happens to us in our submind. It all happens because of our experiences and the things that we've seen in the world, what we understand from what we've seen and what those visual stimuli are. How this happens is we gather the information that we see, information that we smell, all of our different senses of how that comes to be. If it's by touch, sight, if it's by sound, and we turn around and then we see something, what that sound came from, then we know if it's a gunshot, how to react. If it's somebody's voice, we know how to react depending on whose voice. So we evaluate that, then decide how we're going to respond. And that's how our perception works. Step by step, we select information that we want to listen to. If somebody comes in the room talking to me and I have my door closed and I'm trying to do this, I decide I'm going to listen to this as opposed to the door knocking or the dog barking. If we're watching TV or if we're listening to music in the car and somebody's talking to us, we decide if we're going to listen to them, turn down the TV, or try to do both at the same time, multitask. You probably know that when you're text messaging or on your phone, you kind of shut off the whole world and you're kind of concentrated on that. And it's very hard to give 50% here and 50% there as opposed to 75% of what you're doing and 25 somewhere else. I had the term one time, do you want me to give 80% of my attention here and 20 over there? Or do you want me to take care of this 100%? And that's the decision we all have to make. Once we hear that, we're going to organize what we see and interpret it. Organize it into an importance and then interpret it by the way of what we heard before, what our experiences are. If it's the tone of voice of somebody that you really like, well, then you're going to interpret it if they're in a happy mood or if they're mad at you, and go ahead and act appropriately. If it's a scary sound or if it's a happy sound. Yesterday I was with a young friend of mine and we were reading some newspaper clippings of some guy in Japan who dismembered a body and hid the parts all over the place. And when my young friend went to walk home, I had to walk with him because he was scared. He was over here mowing my lawn for me, or cleaning up dog mess. He doesn't mow in the wintertime. But he was over here doing some work. I had to walk home with him because we talked about this, and his perception was something different than mine, all the dark shadows and things like that. So the way we improve perception is have more experiences in the world. Have more experience through reading, through visual, watching TV, watching videos on YouTube, and we understand more things that are going on. Our mental structures that puts together these perceptions are called schemas. And we involve or we construct these schemas off of our prior knowledge and organization. The first time you came to a class at CWI, a live class, you had a schema of what class was going to be like, what the professor was going to be like, the amount of workload you were going to do, how your other classmates was going to interact with you. You had built this schema and it changed over time once you were with that professor. Sometimes the classes verified or validated your schemas. Another time they completely changed what's going on. Schemas is one of those words that have to do with communication theory and the communication classes that you'll want to learn. As I talked about in the last lecture, how things are interpreted a certain way or the vocabulary that you need to learn to match up with this class specifically. Being mindful of your situation is very important. Mindfulness, you're going to be spacing, you're kind of just zoning out. You just took a bunch of melatonin and you're ready to go to sleep, or you got something on your mind and the things that are going on around you aren't as perceptive as other times. I was talking to somebody the other day and their term was situational awareness. Be aware of the situation you're in, the things that are going on around you, and how you can interact or how you should be ready to interact with those things. Sometimes you have selective perception, like I talked about when you're on the phone or when you're text messaging. It's only the information you want that you're understanding, you're paying attention to, and you are zoning out everything else. Last night, when my friend Brody was walking home after doing the dirty did, after cleaning up the dog crap. He had distorted perception, thinking about all the things that were going on around him and comparing them to the stories that he heard about this criminal in Japan dismembering that body. Distorted perception. Sometimes when traumatic things happen to people, they get a distorted perception of the world around them. People coming back from war is that, with PTSD. People that have been in abusive situations that don't want to open themselves up again to relationships have distorted perceptions. Validated, yes, understandable, but yet distorted perceptions. Sometimes they'd get undue influence by that person that was in that abusive relationship, and their perceptions change. I had a son-in-law who was messing with my stepdaughter, and he says he's majoring in psychology in college because he wanted to learn how to mess with my daughter's head more, how to mess with her. He wanted to do undue influence on her. Needless to say, he and I had to have a conversation outside for a few minutes in so he can get a better perception of the world. Another story for another day. I distorted his perception pretty much. So there's different things about us that change our perception. Fundamental attribution error, or overemphasizing internal causes. I'm just reading through this to get it straight in my mind as we do this. What's internal in your head is an attribute of what your perceptions are, your thought processes, what you think are important, what's not. Some people that are very into glamour and glitz or money, and they would perceive somebody that is poor as having less worth than what we are. They would perceive somebody that had a nicer car and a nicer house as being more valuable as a person as we are. The external things they see are different than the internal things as how they judge it. The external things that they miss on somebody that may not be dressed as well. And then people do have a self-serving bias where they are attributing certain things to validate themselves. If they are wearing the same kind of clothes as somebody else, well, then they know that they're cool. This happens a lot whenever you're looking at celebrities on TV and you see the kind of cars they drive or the products they use. You're going to have a bias. If you use them too, you're going to think that you're the same way they are. How to improve your perception. This is pretty good. Be thoughtful and talk to people. It's pretty revolutionary, I know. But when you look at somebody, you need to think about more than just who they are and what they're doing. And don't take that first thought. That first thought is that self-serving bias or that skewed perception where you just take it off of general knowledge. You need to know what's going on. Look at the little indicators. One time I was in the airport with a bunch of students and we were traveling, and there was a guy that came up and started proselytizing his profit-making system. He was selling a pyramid scheme to one of the students, and he was talking about how great it was and how rich this guy can get and how wonderful it was and all the great benefits of it. And the student sat there and listened and was very kind about it. And when the guy was winding down, he blew him off and the guy walked away. And I went over and talked to the student, and I said, on first perception, this guy looked pretty smooth. He was dressed nice and everything looked good. And he was pretty impressive in his communication skills and his eye contact and everything. And you did a great job listening. You're engaged in it. I thought that was really, really great of you. But there's one way to see if people are what they think they are or what they show they want to be when they're in those situations, trying to be rich, trying to get you to make money too. I told him, look at their shoes. And as you look at people's shoes, that's one of the last things that somebody's going to spend money on is their shoes. And as we look back, as he was across that little area, that waiting area, as we were waiting by the boarding gate, he looked at him and the shoes were not what would match his suit and his tie. And I said, that's how you can tell if the guy's all what he says he is, as he's trying to be in business and make money. And that's looking beyond the first impressions and being more be more aware of what was going on. Now, my assumptions of him was he was a charlatan. He was a scammer. Once I thought about it a little bit more, was he sincere? Yeah. Did he believe in his product? Definitely. Did I? No, because of my prior perceptions of what goes on in the world. I'm a little bit more skeptical. A big thing that changes our perspectives is our culture. I talked a lot about my wife and how she was of a Hispanic culture and how I thought about myself. And Hispanics overall changed a lot when we started dating. And she was a third generation American Hispanic. I can't remember the term for that right now. But as I went back into her family and hung out with her family and her relatives, that perspective changed. And it opened my eyes a lot. I was younger then, and I grew up in a really, if this is an offensive, white neighborhood and a very middle-class neighborhood. And as I saw these other things, my perception changes of others. And it rippled through as I went into other areas, and I went to college in San Francisco, and my mind got blown because of all these different cultures I saw. It changed how I even looked at myself. The more we experience, the more we know. One of the great ways we do this nowadays is by movies. We have vicarious experiences. Vicarious experiences where we live our lives through other people and see what it's like. I had a great experience, and there was a visiting professor from China. I'm not sure if I should tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Forgive me. And she was over here, and we talked about, and she taught at a military school, and she taught American studies. And so she was the reigning expert in that school of all things American. What we liked, what we didn't like, what we did, why we did it, and when we did it. And we were talking, we were on a trip on a bus with the team going to Portland. So we had a 6-7 hour drive. And as we were on our way to Portland, we were talking about different cultural aspects and different students and where they came from and what they were like. And I told her, I said, probably 10% of the students in this bus smoke weed. And she said, And I said, yeah. And I said, I bet another 15% or 10% are currently smoking weed. I bet more like 25% have done it, have experienced other drugs. And she looked around and she says, no, I don't believe that. And I said, well, why? What do you think? She says, well, only black people do drugs. And I kind of had a chuckle myself and said, well, that's a stereotype that people have of Americans because of the limited cultural experiences you've had. You haven't seen other things. And as we talked about it, and I showed her some ways to identify people, some stereotypes I have, and some indicators, and we'll talk about stereotypes in a few minutes, and racial profile and things like that. What are a good stereotype? What are accurate? But as we talked about that, her cultural perspective completely changed and how she perceived the world. It was pretty dramatic how her eyes were opened. Kind of like my eyes were opened when I moved from a small white suburban town to live in San Francisco to go to college and saw all the things that were going on there. It was a really cool experience. So some of the perspective barriers that we talked about. Cultural myopia, when she came over from China, she really believed that her culture was correct and that culture would transmit into America. And she learned that she had to act different. There are different social norms, things that she should say and shouldn't say in certain situations. Her, I don't want to say superiority, but her, and this is partly because she was academic, her place in society was different here than it was there. And it was something that she had to adjust to. We're going to talk about stereotyping now. Cultural myopathy. Okay, we talked about relevant in all situations. Stereotyping is putting people into your own mind, what you think of them and what you expect them to be because of the way they dress or the way they act or the vocabulary. A couple of things I always talk about is dumb jock or that preppy cheerleader and what we think of them. If we see somebody panhandling for money, we have an automatic stereotype of what we think they are. And is it appropriate? Is it appropriate what they're doing, where they're doing it? And we all have stereotypes. Now, are those stereotypes appropriate? One time I was leaving a sporting event and there was a definite traffic pattern to get over to where we parked our cars and things like that. And I left early and there wasn't a lot of traffic on this, but there were people loitering, hanging out in this narrow, dark street to get over to where we parked our cars. And it was a bit, I don't know about spooky is the word for it, but apprehensive. And as I stereotyped these men that were loitering there, I thought about my safety, about my reactions if something happened, about being concerned about the people I was with. And I definitely stereotyped that situation. Was it right for me to do it? I think so. Was the stereotype accurate? I kind of think a bit. If I wasn't a big guy and I wasn't with a bunch of other big guys, I think the situation may have been different. Would have been violent or anything like that? I don't want to go there. I don't know. But sometimes we have to stereotype. But are our perceptions and knowledge and experiences, do they make accurate stereotypes? Being prejudiced is something different than being stereotyped. My mom went through World War II. Her brother was killed in World War II he was on an island with the army, and the Japanese invaded and the Japanese won, let's just say that. And she still has a stereotype and a judgment against the Japanese, bordering on prejudice. She still used vernacular and slang against Japanese people that are very inappropriate, and I don't want to use those terms in slang because they've kind of gone out of public knowledge in our vocabulary of the day. But she definitely has a unkind feeling bordering on hatred for him because of the things that she experienced when she was in the war. Prejudice, I think, is taught. I think it's handed down because of your environment. I'm very much a social construction theorist, where our mindset and our thought processes are constructed by the environment we're in. I may have told this story, but last summer I worked in some construction work to make a couple extra bucks, and while I was there, everybody was dropping the F-bomb, and construction workers had a very negative view on women, objectifying them and stuff, and it was just kind of disgusting at times. And as I tried to keep my superior knowledge and abilities and thought processes, my more holier than thou attitude, never thought about that way. Anyway, as I thought about my experiences and how I wanted to perceive and understand and treat people, in my thought processes, all of a sudden I was thinking about F this, F that, in my head, not in my vocabulary. And I knew I needed to get out of that situation because I was going to be influenced to thinking and feeling and acting the way they did. I really think this prejudice is taught by our situations and our surroundings. Sometimes we have the emotional maturity, the strength to overcome those things. I say that you can't walk through a mud puddle without getting muddy, and that mud puddle I was living in that construction started making me muddy, and I had to get out of there and cleanse myself with other good thoughts. I also believe that you can only say no so many times. If you're there with them and you say, no, I don't want to listen to that, no, you need to quit talking about that. That works, but only so many times, and then you get tired of it and you give in. That's it for now. We've been talking for a few minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and upload this to YouTube, then link it to the class, and I'll also have part 2 in a few. So stay tuned. Talk to you later.